Please be seated. Many of you know that back in the 90s, I taught at a Catholic high school on the south side of Chicago. And we were a pretty tight-knit group of faculty. And so every Friday after school, there was just an open invitation to everyone to go to the bar and grill just down the street from the school and have pizza and beer together. And that went on for years. Until one day, we walked into our Monday morning faculty meeting and sat down and found out that a parent and her daughter had come into that same bar and grill where we were while we were there. time, that we not drink, that we not, you know where I'm going with this. And then there is, if I am to confess, my own ideas of righteousness. My own idea of righteousness would be someone who regularly attends church, regularly attends some sort of church function, but more than that even, someone who feeds the poor, who helps the homeless, who cares about the children and the widows, who cares about the imprisoned, who works actively for justice. That is my own measure of righteousness. And I see this as I participate in Lent Madness. Those of you who are here for Ash Wednesday, and some of the rest of you might know this. Every Lent, the Forward Movement does this thing called Lent Madness, a religious spoof on March Madness, in which saints of the church are listed, and the church gathers together and reads about 2 of them each day and votes on the one that they think is holiest. And you keep working through your brackets until someone gets the golden halo. If you look at my bracket right now, you can see that we have gone through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Yes, 7. And I have voted for the person who ultimately won the vote every time so far, but once. So if Cassia doesn't beat Joseph of Arimathea in the next round, that bracket's a dead one for me. And I find myself having to think about what I think of as a righteous saint. For example, the ones that are saints just because they were martyred, but we know nothing about their lives, I tend to dismiss right away. All they did was die. Like, how weird is that? All they did was die. I have no idea about how they lived. The ones where like weird miracles happen, I find them interesting, but that doesn't necessarily make them worthy of my vote. Give me someone like Albert Schweitzer, who did win this bracket and who I voted for, who worked to feed people and heal people and like all this good stuff. And man, I know right away I'm voting for him. Got my own list of what makes one righteous. And we encourage this thinking during Lent, right? When I have us do things like read through the 10 Commandments responsively as a part of the penitential rite. And we get this list of rules. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And when we talk about even doing things like Lent Madness, about what we are giving up or taking on, we get the idea that it's what we do that makes us righteous. But Paul disagrees with us here. And he uses Abraham in our reading for today as his proof, so to speak. You see, the Jews during Jesus' time and Paul's time thought that Abraham was a righteous man because he followed the law. He followed Torah, even though the Torah had not been given to the people by God yet. There was no such thing as Torah when Abraham was alive, but somehow he just knew instinctively what it was to follow Torah, and he did. And that made him righteous. And then at like the age of over 100, he circumcised himself and all of the males in his household. That made him righteous. And then there was the story, of course, of him taking Isaac up the mountain to be sacrificed, because that's what God had told him to do. That made him very righteous. And so the Jews believed that that is what God reckoned as righteousness unto Abraham. But Paul says, nuh-uh. How could he follow Torah when Torah hadn't been invented? And then he says, rightfully, in the reading that we have for today about Abraham from the book of Genesis, God calls Abraham righteous before Abraham did the circumcision thing, before he took Isaac up the mountain to sacrifice him. Abraham's righteousness had nothing to do with what he did. It had to do, he said, with his faith. And Paul is also very clear that faith is less about the doctrine in which we believe as it is about how much we trust our God. So let's take another look at Abraham. He was 99 years old in this reading for today, in which God promises him a child. Since he's 99 years old, we can guess that Sarah was a bit aged as well. But this wasn't the first time God had promised him a child. A few chapters back in Genesis, God also promised him a child when Abraham was just a young pup of 86 years old. So he's 86 years old, which means that Sarah is most definitely past the age of bearing children. And God promises him a child. And this is an unbelievable promise anyway. But then 13 years go by. Think about your life 13 years ago. That's not a short period of time, is it? 13 years go by, and Sarah has still not born a child. The part of this book of Genesis that our lectionary skips, probably because Paul never recognizes it, is that, yes, at first, God comes and talks to him, and Abraham falls on his face in humility and worship. But right after this conversation, Abraham falls on his face in laughter. And he kind of says, really, God? A child? My body's as good as dead. And Sarah, hers too. Look, we've got this son through another woman. His name's Ishmael, but he's mine, just not Sarah's. It's him, you mean, right? And God just says, nope. You and Sarah, you'll have another child. Body's as good as dead or not. And Abraham trusts that promise. not in a blind sort of way. That's why I think this scene where he falls on his face in laughter and says, "Seriously?" is so important. Because it's not like he didn't recognize the obstacles in his way. He did. And at the end of the day, he trusted in God's promise to him. And that is what God reckoned to him as righteousness. Reckoned, by the way, in the Bible has nothing to do with the way Southerners use the word reckoned. It's an economic term. So you might go to Mark, our treasurer, and say, "How am I doing with my pledge?" And he might get out his calculator and his books and say, "Well, I reckon you're about a third of the way through." And that doesn't mean "I think." It means I've figured it out. I've reckoned it. God reckoned Abraham's faith to be righteousness. He doesn't just think he's righteous, he's figured it out. It has been proven. He's done the math. And Abraham is righteous. I wonder if we look at any of the ways that each one of us tend to reckon righteousness, whether that's about purity culture or social justice work or just not smoking and drinking beer on a Friday with your colleagues after work. Whether any of us who have those systems of judging holiness in our heads, whether we truly, in all situations, trust the promises of God. At the end of the day, my friends, that is what Lent is about. That's what the Lent Madness and the Ash Wednesday and the Holy Week and everything in between, the giving something up or the taking something on, that's what all of that is about. Not as a check mark that we can check, did that, I'm going to heaven for sure. But rather as exercises. We call them spiritual exercises. As exercises to help us trust in God, to help us trust in God. And so I'm going to give you a bit of spiritual homework to do, not because it will be reckoned to you as righteousness, but because I think it will help you grow in the spirit of the readings that we have heard today. What do you reckon as righteousness? That's question number one. Question number two, what might you be doing this Lent that will help you grow in your trust of the Lord and of God's promises? Because if what you're doing for Lent is not aiding that, then what you doing it for? Take a look at your own spiritual practices, your own spiritual exercises, and ask yourself, what am I doing this for? What am I doing this for? And what might I do to grow in my trust of the Lord? Amen.